My name is Diana. I am 27 years old, working as a forensic data analyst, and my life changed forever on a random Tuesday. On my very first day at my new job, I spotted a crystal-framed photo of my husband sitting proudly on a coworker's desk. Holding back my absolute shock, I casually complimented the frame and asked who the lucky man was. She beamed and replied that it was her fiancé and that his family had just thrown them a lavish engagement party. I just smiled. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through a betrayal while planning your next move. Walking into the sleek glass-paneled lobby of Vanguard Financial that morning, I felt a profound sense of pride and accomplishment. Securing a position as a senior forensic data analyst at a top-tier firm was the culmination of years of relentless hard work and late nights. My job involved tracking illicit money trails for federal agencies, finding the hidden digital footprints that criminals tried desperately to bury. I was escorted to my new workstation, a modern desk, situated right in the middle of a bustling open-plan office. I set my coffee down, took a deep breath of the crisp air, and prepared to start my day. The woman in the cubicle directly next to mine popped her head over the glass partition. She introduced herself as Heather, a junior account manager. She had perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive acrylic nails, and a bubbly, overly enthusiastic personality that immediately felt forced and grating. As Heather leaned over the divider to hand me a corporate welcome packet, my eyes naturally drifted down to her desk space. Right next to her dual monitors sat a heavy, expensive-looking crystal picture frame. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I stared at the high-resolution photograph inside the frame, my mind struggling to process the image. It was a picture of a couple kissing passionately on a sun-drenched beach in Malibu. The woman was clearly Heather. The man dipping her backward, his hands resting familiarly on her waist, was Gavin, my husband of 3 years. The physical impact of seeing my own husband kissing another woman on my new coworker's desk hit me like a freight train crashing into my chest. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs, making my ears ring. But my professional training kicked in instantly. As a forensic investigator, my entire career revolved around gathering critical evidence without ever alerting the suspects. I forced my facial muscles to relax into a pleasant expression. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee and plastered a warm, curious smile on my face. "That is a beautiful photograph," I said, pointing casually at the crystal frame. "Is that your boyfriend?" Heather practically shrieked with delight. She picked up the frame and held it closer to her chest, her eyes sparkling with vanity. "Actually, he is my fiancé," she corrected me, thrusting her left hand forward to show off a massive, glittering diamond ring. "His name is Gavin. We are getting married next month in Aspen. Is not the ring just absolutely stunning?" I looked closely at the diamond, recognizing the custom vintage cut immediately. "It is truly breathtaking," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even and pleasant. "Did he pick it out himself?" Heather giggled, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "Oh, definitely not. Gavin has great taste, but his mother Barbara actually helped him select the stone. She is the sweetest woman alive. In fact, Barbara and his sister Cassidy just threw us a massive surprise engagement party last weekend. They hosted it at Cassidy and her husband Tyrone's new estate. His entire family absolutely adores me. They treat me like I am already their biological daughter." Every single word out of her mouth was a precise, calculated stab to my chest. The betrayal was not just coming from my husband. It was coming from my own flesh and blood. Just last Friday, I had called my mother Barbara, asking what the family was doing for the weekend. My mother had sighed heavily through the phone, complaining that my depressing workaholic energy would just ruin their quiet family night. She and my sister Cassidy had explicitly banned me from coming over to the estate, claiming they needed a peaceful evening without my constant boring talk about financial audits and data systems. Cassidy had even sent me a text message saying my cheap department store clothes and exhausted face were embarrassing to look at. My African-American brother-in-law, Tyrone, a slick wealth manager who constantly mocked my career, had chimed in on the family group chat. He told me to stay home and do laundry like a good little wife, bragging that his firm was handling real money while I was just a glorified accountant. They had systematically isolated me and degraded my self-worth so they could host an engagement party for my husband and his mistress. My own mother had helped pick out the engagement ring for the woman replacing me. I sat back in my ergonomic office chair, gripping my pen so tightly my knuckles turned white. For 27 years, I had endured their emotional abuse. I had allowed them to treat me like the family scapegoat. I had swallowed their insults when they belittled my career. I had played the dutiful, quiet, supportive wife to Gavin while he supposedly built his business empire from the ground up. The illusion was completely shattered. They were not just toxic and demanding, they were actively conspiring against my life. A sharp buzzing sound pulled me from my dark thoughts. My phone screen lit up on my desk. It was a text message from Gavin. I swiped the notification open and read the screen. Hey babe, I am swamped at the office. I have to work late on a huge investment project with your brother-in-law Tyrone tonight. Grab dinner without me. Love you. Before I could even type a response, a bright chime echoed from Heather's computer. She picked up her phone and squealed with delight, practically vibrating in her chair. Oh my gosh, she announced loudly to the surrounding cubicles. My fiancé is just the best man in the world. He is leaving work early today to take me cake tasting for the wedding. We are trying a red velvet tier tonight. I looked down at Gavin's text message on my screen, and then I looked over at Heather, gushing endlessly over her wedding cake. A chilling, absolute calm washed over my entire body, replacing the shock with pure adrenaline. I did not shed a single tear. I did not confront her. I turned my attention back to my dual monitors. I cracked my knuckles, opened Vanguard Financial's secure server gateway, and quickly bypassed the standard firewall. I booted up the federal tracking software, a highly classified proprietary system designed to trace hidden assets, fraudulent shell companies, and offshore bank accounts across the globe. My family thought I was just a boring, submissive girl who blindly crunched numbers for a meager paycheck. They were about to find out exactly what a federal forensic data analyst could do when she was pushed to the edge. I typed Gavin's social security number into the search bar and pressed enter. The hunt had officially begun. Instead of heading to the empty apartment Gavin and I shared, I pulled my car onto the interstate and drove straight toward my parents' sprawling suburban estate. The preliminary data I had pulled at Vanguard Financial painted a disturbing, fragmented picture of newly opened offshore accounts. I needed to look the liars in the eye. I needed to see exactly how comfortable they were in their deception. The wrought iron gates of the estate were wide open, a testament to their arrogant sense of security. I parked my modest sedan behind a line of luxury vehicles. My father's Mercedes Tyrone's customized Range Rover and Gavin's sleek black Porsche. The same Porsche he claimed he bought, with a sudden mysterious bonus from his logistics firm. I pushed open the heavy oak front door without knocking. The sound of clinking glasses and boisterous laughter echoed down the marble hallway. I walked quietly toward the formal living room and stood in the arched doorway. There, lounging on the custom Italian leather sofa, was my husband. The man who had texted me just an hour ago, claiming he was buried in paperwork at the office. He had a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand, laughing uproariously at something Tyrone had just said. Tyrone stood by the wet bar pouring another round of scotch. My brother-in-law was a towering, impeccably dressed man who wore his arrogance like cologne. As a senior wealth manager, he had completely captivated my parents, convincing them he was the ultimate financial genius. He handed the glass to Gavin, clapping him on the shoulder with familiar camaraderie. Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence. A sharp, nasal voice pierced the air. I turned my head. My sister Cassidy was descending the grand staircase swirling a martini glass. She wore a silk designer lounge set that cost more than my monthly salary. Her eyes swept up and down my sensible navy blue worksuit, her lips curling into a sneer of pure disgust. Nobody invited you, Diana, Cassidy stated loudly, making sure every man in the room stopped and looked at me. You look like a cheap bank teller in that suit. Seriously, no wonder Gavin is always so stressed out. You carry this miserable, exhausting energy everywhere you go. We are trying to celebrate Tyrone's new client acquisitions, and here you are ruining the mood. Gavin had the audacity to look slightly inconvenienced by my arrival. He set his whiskey down, rubbing his forehead to play the part of the tired, burdened husband. He did not ask how my first day at the new job went. He did not bother to explain why he was drinking scotch at my parents' house instead of working late. My father Thomas walked into the room carrying a stack of financial portfolios. He barely glanced at me before turning his beaming, proud attention straight to Tyrone. "Now this is a man who understands how to build a legacy," my father announced, patting Tyrone on the back. "Tyrone is handling real money. He just restructured our entire offshore portfolio. You could learn a thing or two from him, Diana. You are 27 years old and still just a glorified accountant. Learn your place in this family and try to support your husband instead of constantly nagging him with your penny-pinching mindset." A glorified accountant. That was their favorite insult. They completely ignored the fact that my clearance level gave me access to restricted federal databases. They willfully ignored that I was a forensic analyst contracted by federal agencies to track down white-collar criminals. In their eyes, I was just the boring, submissive disappointment of the family. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my career. Arguing would only alert them that the old compliant Diana was gone. Instead, I let my shoulders slump. I manufactured a look of deep, shameful exhaustion. "You are right, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly meek and agreeable. "I am just tired from my first day. My phone is completely dead. Do you mind if I step into your home office to charge it for a few minutes? I will stay out of your way so you all can celebrate." My father waved his hand dismissively, not even bothering to look at me. "Make it quick. Do not touch any of my files. Tyrone left some important merger documents on the desk." "I will not touch a thing," I promised softly. I turned and walked down the hall, the sounds of their renewed laughter biting at my heels. The moment the heavy mahogany door of my father's home office clicked shut behind me, my submissive posture vanished. I locked the door and moved silently toward his massive cherry wood desk. His sleek desktop computer was awake, the screen glowing brightly in the dimly lit room. My father was a creature of arrogant habit. He assumed his home was a fortress, completely oblivious to the reality of digital security. I sat in his leather chair and let my fingers fly across the keyboard. It took me less than 40 seconds to bypass his basic password protection. I dove straight into his local drive, scanning through the nested folders labeled under Tyrone's wealth management firm. I was looking for anything related to Gavin's sudden influx of cash, but what I found made the blood freeze in my veins. I clicked open a folder titled Estate Planning 2026. Inside was a heavily encrypted digital file. I ran a quick decryption script I kept on a secure flash drive on my keychain. The document snapped open. It was a trust transfer authorization. I scanned the legal jargon, my eyes darting to the bottom of the page. It detailed the complete liquidation of the irrevocable trust left to me by my late grandfather. $5 million. For the past 2 years, my parents and Tyrone had repeatedly told me that the inheritance was locked in a complicated probate battle. They claimed the courts had frozen the assets, and it would take a decade to see a single dime. That was a massive, calculated lie. The document showed that the entire $5 million had been forcefully drained from my grandfather's trust just 3 months ago. And right there on the digital signature line was my name. A flawless, perfect forgery of my signature authorizing the total transfer of my inheritance. I traced the routing numbers on the bottom of the ledger. The money had not gone to my parents. The funds had been wired directly into a corporate shell account named G&H Holdings. Gavin and Heather, my own family, had conspired with my husband to steal my $5 million inheritance to fund his new life with his mistress. They were drinking my grandfather's money in the living room while treating me like dirt on their shoes. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approached the office door. I quickly dragged the forged documents into a secure cloud server transfer window, watching the progress bar race toward 100%. The brass doorknob began to turn. I closed the transfer window, yanked my flash drive from the port, and spun around just as the door swung open. Gavin stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowed, his posture rigid with sudden suspicion. "What exactly are you doing in here, Diana?" he demanded, his gaze darting from my face to the bright computer screen. I held up my dead smartphone, dangling the white charging cord from my fingers. I kept my face entirely blank, adopting the dull, submissive expression Gavin expected from me. "Just getting enough battery to order a ride home," I said, my voice dripping with manufactured exhaustion. "Dad made it very clear my presence is ruining your victory lap. I am leaving." Gavin stared at the computer monitor. It was locked on the standard screensaver, now revealing absolutely nothing about the massive data heist that had just occurred. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked annoyed, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire criminal enterprise was now resting safely in my encrypted cloud storage. "You always have to make everything a tragedy, Diana," Gavin muttered, stepping aside to let me pass. "Tyrone is doing incredible things for this family. The least you could do is pretend to be supportive instead of sneaking around like a shadow in your own parents' house." "I will try to be better," I replied softly, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. I walked past my husband, smelling the expensive cologne and top-shelf whiskey on his breath. I marched straight down the long carpeted hallway, ignoring the boisterous laughter echoing from the formal living room. My mother was cackling at something Tyrone had just said, her voice high and grating. I walked out the heavy oak front doors and pulled them shut. The cool night air hit my face, but I barely felt it. My blood was practically boiling with adrenaline. I slid into the driver's seat of my sedan, locked the doors, and immediately pulled out my encrypted flash drive. I plugged it into my personal laptop sitting on the passenger seat. I needed to verify exactly what I had just stolen from my father's hard drive. As the files rendered on my screen, the sheer magnitude of their betrayal stared back at me in high definition. It was a masterclass in financial deception, but to a federal forensic data analyst, it read like an open book. I traced the digital breadcrumbs line by line. 3 months ago, while I was buried in preparations for my new job at Vanguard Financial, Tyrone had initiated a massive trust transfer. My late grandfather had left me a private, irrevocable trust fund worth exactly $5 million. My parents had repeatedly sworn that the money was tied up in a vicious probate battle. They claimed the state had frozen the assets and that I should forget about it for the next decade. The legal documents on my screen proved they had been lying to my face for months. Tyrone had utilized his senior executive credentials at his wealth management firm to completely bypass the probate locks. He had generated a mountain of fraudulent authorization forms to release the funds. And there, sitting at the bottom of the final release document, was my signature. It was an incredibly precise forgery, but I knew instantly it was fake. The stroke pressure was entirely uniform, a clear sign of digital replication. Tyrone had lifted my signature from an old tax return and slapped it onto a document that legally surrendered my entire $5 million inheritance. I tracked the routing numbers. Tyrone did not just steal the money, he actively laundered it. The $5 million had been bounced through 2 offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands before landing squarely in a newly incorporated domestic shell company. The company name was G&H Holdings, Gavin and Heather. My husband and his mistress were fully funding their lavish new life, their expensive vintage diamond rings, and their upcoming destination wedding using my stolen inheritance. And my entire family had rolled out the red carpet to help them do it. I sat in the dark driveway, the blue light of the laptop illuminating my face, and thought about my arrogant brother-in-law. Tyrone was completely untouchable in my family's eyes, and looking at the secondary ledgers I had downloaded, I finally understood why. My father Thomas loved to project the image of a wealthy, successful patriarch. But the hidden accounting files revealed a pathetic truth. My father had lost a massive fortune on terrible real estate bets over the past 5 years. He was drowning in toxic debt. Tyrone had swooped in like a savior. Using his position at the wealth management firm, Tyrone had restructured my father's failing investments, hiding the massive losses behind complex corporate restructuring. Tyrone kept the creditors at bay and maintained the illusion of my parents' wealth. In return, my parents treated Tyrone like an absolute king. They worshipped the ground he walked on. He was the golden son-in-law who could do no wrong, while I was treated as the ultimate scapegoat. They hated me because I actually understood numbers. They knew I could see through their pathetic facade if I ever looked closely enough. So they belittled my career. They called me a glorified bank teller. They constantly beat down my self-esteem, ensuring I remained quiet, submissive, and totally blind to the reality of their financial crimes. They handed over my $5 million inheritance to Tyrone as a reward for keeping my father out of bankruptcy. Gavin got his massive payout, and his new mistress Tyrone got his cut, and my parents got to keep their mansion. I closed my laptop, the screen snapping shut with a sharp, satisfying click. They thought I was stupid. They thought I was weak. They had no idea that every single digital fingerprint they left behind was currently sitting on a federal-grade encrypted server. I started the car engine and pulled out of the driveway, leaving the sprawling estate behind me. I did not shed a single tear for my broken marriage or my treacherous family. I was already calculating my next move. I knew their arrogance would be their downfall. Tyrone was reckless, and Gavin was lazy. They had moved the money, but they still needed to cover their tracks on paper. Federal tax season was rapidly approaching, and a sudden $5 million injection into a shell company would require airtight documentation to survive even a basic internal revenue screening. They would need my legal consent to finalize the asset division without raising red flags. Gavin was going to come to me pretending to be the overworked, loving husband, and he was going to put a pen in my hand. I gripped the steering wheel, a cold smile forming on my lips as I drove through the dark suburban streets. Let them think they have won. Let them plan their lavish wedding and drink their expensive scotch. Let them believe the quiet, boring data analyst was completely oblivious to their grand scheme. Tomorrow morning, the real game would begin, and I was going to let my husband hand me the very weapon I would use to absolutely destroy him. I did not flinch. I slowly held up my dead smartphone and the white charging cord. "Just trying to get enough juice to call a ride," I said, letting out a heavy, defeated sigh. My phone died on the drive over. Dad told me to make it quick, so I just plugged it into the tower. I deliberately let my shoulders sag, playing the part of the beaten-down wife. Gavin's suspicious glare softened into a look of sheer patronizing pity. He glanced at the standard Windows screensaver, bouncing across Thomas's monitor, completely oblivious to the $5 million heist I had just archived to a federal server. "You always make things so difficult," Gavin muttered, shaking his head. "Come on, I will drive you home. Tyrone and your dad are busy." The next morning, the sun streamed through the kitchen windows of our sterile, overly modern house. Gavin was already dressed in his tailored suit, sipping espresso. He slid a thick stack of stapled papers across the marble island toward me. "I need you to sign these before I head out," he said, rubbing his eyes to emphasize how hard he was working. "Tyrone needs to file our joint tax returns today. He found a loophole that saves us a massive penalty, but the deadline is strict." I looked down at the documents. The top page was a standard IRS tax form. But my forensic training immediately kicked in. The thickness of the stack was entirely wrong for a simple joint filing. I casually slid my thumb down the edge of the pages, fanning them out just a fraction of an inch. Hidden beneath the tax forms was a highly specialized legal document, a post-nuptial asset waiver. By signing the back page, I would be legally relinquishing all rights to any marital assets shielding his shell company and my stolen inheritance from any future divorce proceedings. Gavin was trying to legally rob me blind while pretending to do our taxes. Before I could read the fine print, my phone buzzed sharply on the counter. It was my mother. I answered the call and put it on speaker, maintaining my blank expression. "Diana." Barbara's voice snapped through the speaker, crisp and demanding. "Gavin told me you are being difficult about the tax filings. Just sign whatever Tyrone gives you. Tyrone is doing us a massive favor by managing your disorganized finances." I kept my voice steady. "Mom, I just want to read what I am signing. I am an analyst. It is my job to look at the numbers." Barbara let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You punch data into a spreadsheet, Diana. Tyrone handles high-yield wealth. If you ruin his filing deadline because of your stubbornness, you are dead to this family. You will not be welcome at the Aspen retreat next week. Stop making your husband's life a living hell and just sign the papers." Her words were a perfect reflection of how she had treated me my entire life. My mother had always demanded my blind obedience to the men in the family. She worshipped Tyrone because he maintained her wealthy socialite illusion, and she coddled Gavin because he played the part of the perfect son-in-law. To her, my career tracking federal financial crimes was just a silly little desk job. She hung up without another word. Gavin looked at me with a soft, manipulative smile. "She just wants what is best for us, Diana," Gavin said, reaching across the island to touch my hand. "I am exhausted. Please just sign it so I can get to work." I looked at my husband. I looked at the man who was currently funding his new life with his mistress using my dead grandfather's money. I reached into my purse and pulled out my favorite pen. It was a sleek black specialized friction pen issued to forensic field agents for temporary evidence logging. The ink was chemically engineered to completely evaporate at room temperature within 24 hours. To the naked eye, it looked like standard black ink. To a federal court, a signature made with this pen was legally non-existent. I knew Gavin needed to believe he had won. He needed to see me break to feel secure in his arrogant little plan. So I forced moisture into my eyes. I let a single convincing tear roll down my cheek. I let out a jagged sob, playing the role of the broken submissive wife who had finally given up the fight. "I am sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. "I am just so stressed out about my new job. I trust you, Gavin. I trust you and Tyrone." I flipped to the back page of the hidden post-nuptial agreement and pressed the tip of my friction pen against the paper. I signed my name with a flourish, pressing hard enough to leave a physical indent, but ensuring the vanishing ink saturated the page. I flipped back to the front and signed the tax form for good measure. Gavin snatched the papers off the counter with lightning speed, unable to completely hide his triumphant smirk. "Thank you," he said smoothly, sliding the documents into his leather briefcase. "I will drop these off with Tyrone on my way to the office. Have a good day at work, honey." He walked out the door, whistling a cheerful tune. I stood in the kitchen and wiped the fake tear from my cheek, replacing it with a razor-sharp smile. Gavin thought he held an ironclad contract that stripped me of everything. He did not know that by tomorrow morning that page would be entirely blank, rendering the post-nuptial agreement completely void. More importantly, by submitting a deliberately altered document hidden beneath federal tax forms to a licensed wealth manager, my husband had just anchored himself to felony document fraud. I packed up my laptop and grabbed my car keys. I had a brand new job to get to, and a very specific coworker I needed to keep a close eye on. When I arrived at Vanguard Financial an hour later, the office was already buzzing with activity. I settled into my chair and watched Heather practically skip to her desk. She was holding a massive cardboard box filled to the brim with chaotic, disorganized paperwork. She dropped the heavy box directly onto my desk with a loud thud, causing my coffee cup to rattle. "The boss said the new girl needs to digitize these dead-end accounts by tomorrow," Heather announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She leaned against my cubicle partition, crossing her arms and snapping her chewing gum. "It is grunt work, I know, but we all have to pay our dues. Make sure every single page is scanned, indexed, and uploaded to the archive server before you leave tonight. Do not mess up the filing tags." I looked from the dusty, chaotic mountain of crumpled receipts, faded bank statements, and mislabeled manila folders up to Heather's perfectly contoured face. She was a junior account manager possessing absolutely zero authority to assign me tasks. I was a senior forensic data analyst, hired specifically by Vanguard Financial's executive board to oversee high-level federal compliance. Digitizing garbage files was the job of an entry-level intern. Heather was intentionally playing the office bully, testing the waters to see how much abuse the quiet, plainly dressed new girl would take. I forced my features into a mask of mild, compliant panic. I adjusted my glasses and pulled the box closer to my chest. "Of course, Heather," I said, keeping my voice low and agreeable. "I will get right on it. I want to make sure I do a good job my first week." Heather rolled her eyes, clearly bored by my immediate submission. She spun around in her ergonomic chair and waved frantically at a coworker walking past. "Chloe, oh my gosh, come look at this!" Heather shrieked, grabbing her phone and thrusting the screen toward the other woman. "Gavin sent me the virtual tour link this morning. He is just the most amazing fiancé on the planet." Chloe leaned over, her eyes widening in manufactured awe. Is that a pool overlooking the ocean, Heather? That place is massive. It is our starter home, Heather bragged, her voice carrying across the entire open-plan office. Gavin is basically a real estate mogul now. He just closed this massive logistics deal and told me we are buying a $3 million property in Malibu. Cash. He said he wants his future wife to wake up to the sound of the waves every single morning. He even hired a private designer to fly out next week to pick out custom Italian marble for the master bath. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on the edges of the cardboard box. A $3 million starter home in Malibu. Paid in cash. I did the math in my head instantly. The $5 million irrevocable trust my grandfather had left me had been drained just months ago. Tyrone had laundered the funds through offshore accounts and dumped them into the G&H Holdings shell company. Gavin was not a real estate mogul. He was a thief using his wife's stolen inheritance to buy a beach house for the woman sitting in the cubicle next to mine. The sheer audacity of her bragging echoed in my ears, but I did not let a single ounce of rage show on my face. I had a job to do. I turned my attention to the box of garbage. Heather had undoubtedly picked the messiest, most convoluted box from the archive basement just to make my day miserable. I pulled out the first stack of papers. They were covered in coffee stains and paper clips haphazardly shoved into folders labeled with random alphanumeric codes. I booted up my dual monitors, bypassed the standard employee gateway, and logged directly into the secure federal tracking software I had quietly installed yesterday. I placed the first batch of documents into the high-speed optical scanner and pressed the green button. The machine whirred to life, pulling the pages through and rendering them as high-resolution digital files on my left monitor. I started typing the names and routing numbers into my federal database on the right monitor, intending to quickly log the dead-end accounts and move on to hunting down Tyrone's offshore ledgers. The first few files were exactly what they appeared to be: bankrupt LLCs, closed corporate checking accounts, and abandoned escrow funds. Standard corporate detritus. But as I dug deeper into the middle of the box, the texture of the paperwork changed. The crumpled receipts gave way to crisp, heavy bond paper. The random alphanumeric codes on the folders shifted into a highly structured serialized naming convention. I pulled out a thick ledger bound in a black leather folder. I flipped it open and scanned the first page. My hands stopped moving. The breath froze in my lungs. The logo at the top of the page belonged to Apex Equities. It was a subsidiary holding firm. I quickly typed the subsidiary's tax identification number into the federal database. The system thought for a fraction of a second before flashing a direct corporate hierarchy tree on my screen. Apex Equities was a direct subsidiary of Tyrone's Wealth Management Group. I grabbed the next folder from the box. It was a wire transfer log from a company called Blue Horizon Logistics. I typed that name into the database. It was another subsidiary wholly owned by Tyrone's firm. I started pulling files out of the box with frantic, calculated precision. Every single document in the bottom half of this box belonged to the corporate umbrella, managed by my arrogant brother-in-law. I looked closely at the numbers on the Blue Horizon Logistics ledger. Massive sums of money were being moved in structured identical increments. $50,000 transferred on the 1st of the month. $50,000 transferred on the 15th. The money was being funneled into dummy vendor accounts for services that clearly did not exist. Consulting fees for non-existent offshore marketing firms. Supply chain audits conducted by companies that had no physical addresses. It was a classic textbook layering technique used to clean dirty money. I ran the routing numbers through the highly classified IRS tracking interface. The screen flashed bright red. A bold warning banner appeared across my monitor. These were not dead-end accounts. They were active, heavily monitored ledgers. The IRS had just flagged these exact routing numbers last week for suspected massive money laundering. They were currently building a federal case against the unknown entities controlling the accounts. And Heather, in her petty attempt to play the office bully and humiliate the boring new girl, had just walked down to the basement archives and handed me the physical, unredacted, original ledgers. She had just handed a federal forensic data analyst the exact smoking gun needed to connect Tyrone's pristine wealth management firm directly to a massive illegal money laundering syndicate. I sat back in my chair staring at the red warning banner reflecting in my glasses. I looked over the glass partition at Heather. She was still giggling on the phone, likely looking at paint swatches for her stolen Malibu mansion. My family thought they had committed the perfect crime. They thought they had buried me in paperwork and silenced me with insults. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had vastly underestimated the woman they had spent my entire life breaking down. I slowly picked up the Blue Horizon logistics ledger, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. The hunt was over. The slaughter was about to begin. I cracked open the Blue Horizon logistics ledger and began feeding the pages through my high-speed scanner. As the digital ink populated my screen, the grand architecture of Vanguard Financial's current federal contract became glaringly obvious. My new firm was not merely a high-end accounting agency. Vanguard was an elite federal contractor actively weaponized by the Department of the Treasury to audit and dismantle this exact network of corporate shell companies. The IRS had flagged the anomalies, but they needed Vanguard's specialized software to untangle the offshore knots. Heather, in her petty, desperate attempt to assert dominance over the new girl, had bypassed strict federal evidence protocols. She had marched into a restricted archival vault, grabbed the most complex box of unredacted financial evidence she could find, and dropped it right onto the desk of the only person with the motive and clearance to obliterate her entire future. She had handed me the exact tools I needed to destroy her. My fingers danced across the keyboard, mapping the digital landscape of Tyrone's criminal empire. I opened a proprietary visual mapping program and began dropping data points onto the blank digital canvas. First, I placed Tyrone's wealth management firm at the center. I drew a solid red line connecting his firm to Apex Equities and another to Blue Horizon Logistics. From there, the money spiderwebbed outward. I needed to see the full extent of my parents' complicity, so I ran a deep forensic trace on my father's supposedly untouchable real estate portfolio. The screen populated with a cascade of property deeds and bank liens. My father was not just losing money. He was utterly hopelessly bankrupt. To keep up appearances, Thomas and Barbara had authorized Tyrone to execute 3 separate highly illegal mortgages against their sprawling suburban estate. Tyrone had falsified their income statements, wildly inflated the appraisal value of the property, and secured federal loans using phantom collateral. I tracked where that illegal mortgage money went. It did not go into offshore investments or safe mutual funds. The capital was routed directly into a series of dummy vendor accounts managed by Cassidy. My sister was using federally defrauded loan money to fund her lavish unemployed lifestyle. Every designer handbag, every imported sports car, every extravagant trip to Aspen was paid for with stolen bank funds. But Tyrone did not stop there. He had siphoned the remaining mortgage capital and funneled it directly into Gavin's fake logistics company. For 3 years, I had believed my husband was working 90-hour weeks to build a legitimate shipping enterprise. The federal ledgers proved his company owned 0 trucks, employed 0 drivers, and shipped absolutely no freight. Gavin's entire business was nothing more than a glorified washing machine for Tyrone's illegal mortgage fraud. Gavin would take the dirty money, filter it through his fake payroll accounts, and kick it back to Tyrone's offshore holdings, skimming a generous percentage off the top for his trouble. And then came the final fatal stroke. When my grandfather's $5 million trust fund finally cleared probate, Tyrone could not resist the ultimate payday. He had used the exact same laundering network he built for my parents' mortgages to steal my inheritance, routing it straight into G&H Holdings. I sat back and stared at the completed visual map on my monitor. It was a breathtaking, horrifying masterpiece of white-collar crime. Tyrone was the architect orchestrating the fraud to line his own pockets. Thomas and Barbara were the desperate, complicit fools, trading their freedom for the illusion of wealth. Cassidy was the greedy beneficiary, blindly spending stolen cash. Gavin was the opportunistic parasite, playing the dutiful husband while actively robbing me blind. And Heather was the clueless, arrogant mistress, eagerly spending federal evidence on Malibu real estate. They were all inextricably linked, bound together by thousands of lines of irrefutable digital code. They had built their entire kingdom of glass and lies right on top of a federal fault line. I began cross-referencing the forged trust transfer documents I had pulled from my father's computer last night with the original ledgers Heather had so generously provided. I compiled the offshore routing numbers, the fake vendor invoices, and the illegal mortgage approvals into a single massive encrypted dossier. Every piece of the puzzle locked together with terrifying precision. I categorized the files under federal racketeering, wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. A heavy shadow fell across my desk, blocking the fluorescent office lighting. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked on the digital map of Tyrone's destruction as a tall, imposing figure stepped up to the edge of my cubicle. It was Marcus Vance, the senior director of federal compliance at Vanguard Financial. He was a notoriously ruthless former federal prosecutor who demanded absolute perfection from his analysts. Vance stood perfectly still, his sharp gaze dropping from my face to the cardboard box sitting on my desk. He stared at the original unredacted Blue Horizon logistics ledgers resting right next to my keyboard. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin as he recognized the classified corporate logos printed on the heavy bond paper. "Diana," Vance said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, authoritative whisper, "those physical files are highly classified federal evidence. They are supposed to be locked in the restricted subterranean vault under constant surveillance. Why do you have them sitting out in the open on a junior analyst desk?" I slowly took my hands off the keyboard. I let the silence hang in the air for a fraction of a second, savoring the absolute power vibrating through my veins. I looked up at Director Vance, meeting his intense stare with cold, unwavering certainty. A sharp, predatory smile formed on my lips. "Because," I replied, my voice steady and perfectly clear, "I am about to close your biggest case." Director Marcus Vance stared at me, his icy blue eyes narrowing as his mind processed my brazen statement. He leaned closer to the monitor, his gaze sweeping over the complex digital web I had constructed across my dual screens. The red lines connecting Tyrone's wealth management firm to the dummy vendors, the illegal mortgages, and Gavin's fake logistics company told a flawless story of high-level financial treason. Vance was a former federal prosecutor who had built his entire career on tearing down corrupt corporate empires. He recognized a bulletproof indictment when he saw one. "You traced all of this in less than an hour," Vance stated, his voice devoid of its usual aggressive bark. He looked down at the physical ledgers sitting on my desk. "And the junior account manager simply handed you the primary evidence. Heather thought she was hazing the new girl with dead-end archival paperwork," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. "She was completely unaware that she was handing over the exact unredacted subsidiary ledgers the Internal Revenue Service requested for your federal audit. My brother-in-law is the architect of the laundering scheme. My husband and my parents are his primary beneficiaries." Vance slowly straightened his posture. A terrifying, predatory gleam appeared in his eyes. He recognized that I was not asking for personal sympathy. I was handing Vanguard Financial the golden ticket to execute a massive federal takedown. "Map every single cent, Diana," Vance ordered softly. "Lock down the cloud backups. Flag the shell companies in the Federal Registry. When you have the entire network sealed, we bypass standard protocol and hand this directly to the Department of Justice." He turned and walked back to his executive suite without another word, leaving me with absolute clearance to dismantle my family's criminal enterprise. I spent the next 4 hours systematically locking the trap. I cross-referenced the forged trust documents against the offshore deposits, ensuring that Tyrone and Gavin were legally anchored to the $5 million theft. I compiled the evidence of my parents' fraudulent mortgages, packaging the forged appraisals and fake income statements into pristine federal disclosure files. The entire house of cards was ready to shatter. Just as I initiated the final encrypted backup, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the desk. The screen lit up with a notification from the group chat my family used to coordinate their various social events. I picked it up and tapped the screen. My mother, Barbara, had sent a message to the entire group. "We are taking a special family retreat to Aspen next week. Diana, you need to stay behind and clear out the garage. Thomas needs the extra space for his new vintage car collection, and you are the only one with the free time to do manual labor." My father immediately chimed in below her message. Do not argue about this, Diana. We need a peaceful family vacation, and your negative energy always ruins the atmosphere. Make yourself useful and have the garage pristine by the time we get back. Cassidy was the next to reply, attaching a photo of a pair of glittering diamond-studded ski boots. Exactly. Leave the heavy lifting to the glorified accountant. Some of us actually have important client networking to do on the slopes. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of their deception washed over me, but it did not break me. It only sharpened my focus. Aspen. My mind instantly flashed back to my very first morning at Vanguard Financial. Heather leaning over the cubicle wall, showing off her massive diamond ring. She had bragged loudly to anyone who would listen that she and Gavin were getting married next month in Aspen. My mother had helped pick out the ring. Cassidy had hosted the engagement party. The pieces locked together with sickening clarity. This was not a family retreat. There was no client networking on the slopes. My entire family, my mother, my father, my sister, and my brother-in-law were flying to Aspen to attend my husband's destination wedding to his mistress. They were treating it like a lavish family vacation, a grand celebration paid for entirely with the $5 million they had conspired to steal from my grandfather's trust. They were going to stand there and watch Gavin marry another woman, while I was ordered to stay home like a dutiful servant and clean out their garage. They believed they had completely discarded me. They thought I was so beaten down, so financially dependent and oblivious, that I would simply accept being excluded and do their chores while they celebrated my replacement. I did not throw my phone. I did not type out a furious, emotionally unstable paragraph demanding answers. I knew that engaging with them would only alert them to the fact that I was on to their scheme. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to get on that private jet and fly 1,000 miles away, gathering themselves into one convenient location where they could not access their local bank branches or intercept any physical mail. I kept my fingers steady as I typed my response into the group chat. Have a great time. I will get started on the garage this weekend. I hit send and watched the read receipts populate immediately. None of them replied. They simply went back to discussing their packing lists. I set the phone down and let out a long, slow breath. The absolute calm of a forensic investigator taking control of a crime scene settled into my bones. With my family completely out of state and distracted by wedding festivities, I had the perfect uninterrupted window to execute the final financial strike. I was not just going to hand them over to the federal government. I was going to ensure they had absolutely nothing left when the agents arrived. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a heavy encrypted secondary phone I kept strictly for high-level forensic investigations. I booted it up and bypassed the dual-factor authentication, scrolling through my secure contacts until I found the name I needed. Silas Thorne was an independent shadow broker. He operated in the dark, complex, gray areas of corporate finance, buying and selling toxic debt, defaulted mortgages, and high-risk promissory notes for private investors. I had contracted him twice before on behalf of the Treasury Department to track down untraceable assets. He was ruthless, incredibly fast, and he owed me a massive favor. I pressed the call button and listened to the secure line encrypt the connection. Silas answered on the second ring, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Diana, it has been a long time. Tell me you have a lucrative disaster for me to clean up. I have something better, I replied, pulling up the digital files containing my parents' illegal mortgages and Gavin's fraudulent shell company loans. I am sending you a dossier of heavily leveraged, highly toxic corporate and residential debt. The collateral is completely fraudulent, and the borrowers are about to be indicted by the federal government. I am listening, Silas murmured, the sound of typing echoing in the background. I need you to leverage your private equity contacts to aggressively buy up every single one of these notes before the end of the business week. Acquire the debt, hold the paper, and prepare to execute immediate aggressive foreclosure protocols. You want to collapse their entire financial structure while they are completely exposed. Silas noted, his tone laced with dark amusement. Exactly, I said, my eyes fixed on the empty cubicle where Heather usually sat. It is time to buy up some debt. Silas's raspy laugh crackled through the encrypted speaker, a sound like dry leaves crushing under heavy boots. He did not ask for moral justifications or personal background. Silas only asked for the target coordinates and the wire transfer. I transmitted the specific portfolio identification numbers for my parents' 3 illegal residential mortgages, along with the heavily leveraged corporate lines of credit anchoring Tyrone's wealth management firm. "These notes are radioactive, Diana," Silas murmured, the rapid clacking of his keyboard echoing over the secure line. "The originating banks are quietly panicking. The collateral is completely phantom, and the offshore layering reeks of federal scrutiny. They know the paper is toxic. They just do not know the Department of Justice is already drafting the indictments. That is exactly why they will sell," I replied, my voice cool and detached. "I need you to leverage your private equity contacts to aggressively buy up every single one of these notes before the end of the business week. Set up a legally blind proxy trust. Shield the ownership identity completely. Acquire the debt, hold the paper, and prepare the framework to execute immediate aggressive foreclosure protocols. You want to collapse their entire financial architecture while they are completely exposed." Silas noted, his tone laced with dark professional admiration. "I can secure this debt for pennies on the dollar. The banks will practically hand it to us just to get the liability off their books." I wired Silas the necessary capital using my personal savings. It was the quiet, ironclad emergency fund I had spent my entire adult life building, entirely separate from my grandfather's stolen trust. While Silas executed the rapid acquisitions through his labyrinth of offshore proxy entities, I kept my eyes locked on the digital map of my family's financial ruin. For 2 decades, Thomas and Barbara had maintained a flawless illusion of untouchable aristocracy. They hosted extravagant charity galas in their sprawling suburban estate, sipping vintage champagne, while actively mocking my practical clothes and my sensible career. I remembered the endless holiday dinners where they treated me with thinly veiled contempt. They viewed my position as a forensic data analyst as a boring blue-collar embarrassment. They forced me to park my used sedan on the street, so Cassidy's imported convertible and Tyrone's luxury SUV could dominate the grand circular driveway. They proudly told their high society friends that I simply lacked the ambition required to achieve true wealth. But the glaring red ledgers on my monitor told the true story of their glamorous existence. They were drowning. My parents had lived wildly beyond their means, funding their country club memberships, their European vacations, and Cassidy's endless shopping sprees through a terrifying, unstable pyramid of debt. Tyrone had promised them endless returns, posing as a financial genius, while actively mismanaging every single legitimate asset they owned. When the real money ran dry, Tyrone turned to outright fraud, using their estate as leverage for highly illegal, unsecured loans. My family had eagerly traded their financial souls for the mere appearance of success. They despised me for being ordinary, completely unaware that their entire lives were built on a fragile, rotting facade. By noon on Thursday, Silas sent a single encrypted confirmation code to my secure terminal. The transactions were complete. The banks, desperate to wash their hands of Tyrone's toxic paper before the federal regulators arrived, had sold the entire debt portfolio to my blind proxy trust. I sat in my quiet cubicle, the steady hum of the Vanguard financial office buzzing around me, and let the sheer magnitude of the reality settle into my bones. I now owned the mortgages on my parents' sprawling estate. I owned the corporate debt keeping Tyrone's firm afloat. I was their sole legal creditor. With one single phone call, I could initiate immediate aggressive foreclosure proceedings. I could seize the estate, liquidate Tyrone's firm, freeze their assets, and leave them standing on the curb with absolutely nothing. And they had absolutely no idea. At this very moment, they were boarding a private jet funded entirely by my stolen inheritance. They were flying to Aspen to celebrate my husband marrying another woman. They were treating his bigamous destination wedding like a lavish family vacation. They truly believed they had completely discarded me. They thought I was so beaten down, so financially dependent and oblivious, that I would dutifully stay home and clean out their garage while they celebrated my replacement. I pictured Gavin smiling in his tailored tuxedo, holding Heather's hand, entirely oblivious to the federal snare closing around his throat. I pictured my mother toasting the new perfect couple with stolen champagne, completely unaware that the grand house she intended to return to no longer legally belonged to her. They were going to dance on my grave, unaware that I was the one holding the shovel. I closed the communication portal with Silas and prepared to run the final security sweep on the federal evidence dossier. I needed to ensure the encryption holding Tyrone and Gavin's money laundering records was impenetrable before handing the files over to Director Vance. I reached for my mouse, my eyes scanning the dual monitors to verify the digital locks. Suddenly, the screen on my right went entirely black. A massive bright yellow warning banner flashed across the dark display, pulsing with a silent, urgent rhythm. Critical security alert. Unauthorized access attempt detected. I froze. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I quickly bypassed the warning screen and pulled up the internal network monitoring software I had covertly installed on my machine during my first hour at the firm. The system was tracking a direct aggressive intrusion attempt originating from a terminal inside the Vanguard Financial Building. Someone was actively trying to breach the restricted federal servers. I traced the IP address of the attacking terminal, my eyes narrowing as the user identification populated on my screen. It was Heather's terminal. She was not on the private jet to Aspen yet. She was still in the building, and she was currently attempting to use my specific login credentials to bypass the Vanguard firewall. She was trying to access the restricted Federal Archive directory to manually delete the digital audit files associated with G&H Holdings. The blinking cursor on my monitoring software charted Heather's clumsy, aggressive path through Vanguard's secondary firewall. She was not executing a sophisticated cyber attack. She was using a crude, commercially available script, likely purchased off the dark web, paired with my stolen login credentials. Gavin must have lifted my password from my home office laptop before he packed his bags for Aspen, handing his mistress the keys to my professional execution. I sat back in my chair, interlacing my fingers as I watched her progress bar creep across my screen. Heather was not simply trying to erase the G&H Holdings ledgers. She was initiating a massive unauthorized download of highly sensitive client financial portfolios. Her strategy was incredibly transparent. She intended to pull a massive cache of confidential data, route it to an external server, and completely wipe the original audit files tying Tyrone and Gavin to the money laundering syndicate. Because she was operating under my secure credentials, the catastrophic data breach would lead internal security directly back to my workstation. I would be immediately terminated, discredited, and likely face federal prosecution for corporate espionage. My audit findings would be entirely invalidated as the desperate, fabricated lies of a disgraced criminal employee. Gavin and Tyrone would be free to enjoy their Aspen wedding, their stolen millions securely hidden behind a firewall of my ruined reputation. Heather's sheer arrogance was breathtaking, but it was not surprising. It aligned perfectly with the performance I had witnessed in the employee break room just 2 days prior. I had walked in to grab a cup of black coffee, stepping quietly into the tiled kitchen area. Heather was holding court by the high-end espresso machine, her manicured hand resting on the shoulder of a junior account executive. She was laughing, that sharp, practiced laugh she used to assert dominance. "I give her until Friday," Heather had sneered loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "Have you seen her shoes? She looks like she buys her wardrobe in bulk from a discount catalog. The boring data cruncher will not last the week. Gavin always says people like her just crack under corporate pressure. They do not have the spine for high-level finance." I had stood directly behind her, pouring my coffee, completely invisible in my plain gray suit. Heather had glanced over her shoulder, made direct eye contact with me, and simply smirked, entirely unashamed of her cruelty. She believed I was weak. She believed my silence was submission. Now, watching her digital avatar blindly smash against Vanguard's security gates, I realized just how fatal her overconfidence truly was. Heather thought she was setting a trap for a mouse. She did not realize she had just walked into a tiger cage. My hands returned to the keyboard, my fingers flying across the keys with cold, calculated precision. If I locked her out now, she would simply claim her terminal was hacked. She would walk away clean. I needed her to fully commit to the crime. I needed her to leave irrefutable digital DNA all over the stolen files. Instead of severing her connection, I executed a rapid administrative override. I opened a quarantined virtual sandbox environment deep within my secure terminal. I swiftly cloned the G&H Holdings audit files, duplicating the folder structures, the naming conventions, and the file sizes. But I did not leave the data intact. I weaponized it. I injected the cloned documents with highly classified invisible federal watermarks. These were not simple tracking pixels. They were active cryptographic beacons utilized exclusively by the Department of the Treasury to track stolen corporate data across global networks. I layered the files with active tracing scripts that would permanently embed themselves into the hard drive of whatever device attempted to store them. With the decoy payload perfectly engineered, I rerouted Heather's intrusion pathway. I smoothly bypassed her connection away from the genuine Vanguard servers and funneled her directly into my isolated sandbox. On my screen, a green notification flashed. Heather had taken the bait. She had breached the dummy folder. The monitoring software showed her frantically highlighting the massive batch of watermarked files. She initiated the delete command for the originals, completely unaware she was merely erasing phantom data generated seconds ago. Then she initiated the download protocol to pull the heavily laced decoys onto a physical external flash drive plugged into her workstation. I watched the progress bar on my secondary monitor fill with terrifying speed. 10%, 40%, 80%. I could almost picture her sitting in her cubicle down the hall, her heart racing with malicious excitement, dreaming of the lavish Aspen wedding my ruined career was about to finance. She was probably already composing a gloating text message to Gavin, bragging about how easily she had neutralized his pathetic, boring wife. The progress bar hit 100%. The transfer complete notification chimed softly through my headset. Heather had successfully stolen the files. She had officially committed felony corporate espionage. The moment the external drive disconnected from her terminal, my trap sprang shut. The active tracing scripts embedded in the decoy files instantly executed their primary directive. They bypassed Vanguard's internal security network entirely and opened a direct, heavily encrypted line to a specialized federal server. A small black command window popped up in the bottom corner of my right monitor. Lines of stark white text scrolled downward at lightning speed. The federal beacons were transmitting. They silently pinged the FBI Cybercrimes Division with a catastrophic security alert. The transmission included the exact MAC address of Heather's specific workstation, her employee identification number, the precise geographical coordinates of her terminal, and a complete, unalterable digital log of her unauthorized intrusion. She had not just left fingerprints, she had handed the federal government a signed confession. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, feeling a profound, chilling sense of calm wash over the chaotic open-plan office. By the time Heather boarded her first-class flight to Aspen tomorrow morning, her stolen flash drive would be broadcasting a continuous, high-priority federal tracking signal directly to the Department of Justice. I reached over and picked up my coffee mug, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast was entirely cold, but it tasted like absolute victory. Heather and Gavin thought they were flying off to a fairy tale destination wedding. They had no idea they were walking straight into the center of a massive, inescapable federal indictment. And I was going to ensure that every single member of my treacherous family was standing right there beside them when the hammer finally fell. I packed my briefcase and left the Vanguard Financial Building with the serene posture of a woman who had just scheduled the demolition of her own life. The crisp evening air felt electric against my skin. As I walked toward my car, my personal cell phone vibrated. The screen illuminated with a message from Gavin. He was asking me to meet him at l'Orangerie, the most exclusive French restaurant in the downtown district. He claimed he had managed to secure a last-minute reservation and wanted to treat me to a special date night to make up for his upcoming absence. The invitation was a glaring anomaly. Gavin had not taken me on a spontaneous date in over 3 years. I arrived at the restaurant wearing a simple, understated gray dress, perfectly playing the part of the exhausted, unremarkable accountant he believed me to be. The maitre d' guided me to a secluded candlelit corner booth. Gavin was already waiting. He wore his tailored charcoal suit, his hair impeccably styled, radiating the manufactured magnetic charm he usually reserved for his high-net-worth clients. He stood up immediately, kissed my cheek with practiced warmth, and pulled out my chair. The performance was nauseatingly flawless. He ordered an expensive bottle of Bordeaux without looking at the price. He leaned across the pristine white tablecloth, reaching out to gently hold my hand. He spun a beautiful, highly empathetic narrative about how hard I had been working lately. He told me how stressed I looked, how much he appreciated my dedication, and how deeply he hated leaving me behind to go on his boring corporate retreat in Aspen. I matched his energy with terrifying precision. I slumped my shoulders just slightly, offering a tired, grateful smile. I complained about the endless, mind-numbing data entry at Vanguard. I told him how intimidating the corporate environment was and how I felt like I was constantly drowning in paperwork. Gavin nodded sympathetically, offering reassuring platitudes, but his eyes were cold and calculating. I saw right through the romantic facade. He was not here to reconnect with his wife. He was here to conduct a final desperate security sweep. He needed absolute concrete certainty that I was oblivious to his affair, his embezzlement, and his impending bigamous wedding. He needed to ensure I had not installed any location-sharing applications or spyware on my devices that might alert me to his actual activities in Colorado. Right on cue, midway through our entrees of seared duck and truffle risotto, Gavin patted his pockets with a manufactured sigh of frustration. He frowned, pulling out his own phone and tapping the black screen. "My battery is completely dead," Gavin said, injecting the perfect amount of casual annoyance into his voice. "I desperately need to check the final score of the playoff game. Tyrone and I have a ridiculous wager riding on it. Do you mind if I just borrow your phone for one quick minute?" I did not hesitate. I reached into my purse and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. I unlocked the home screen and slid the device across the table. I watched his eyes track the phone with hungry, predatory anticipation. What Gavin did not know was that the device I handed him was not my primary phone. It was a cloned decoy meticulously engineered for this exact scenario. I took a slow, deliberate bite of my dinner, watching him casually swipe past the sports browser. Within seconds, his thumb subtly navigated straight to my text messages. He thought he was being incredibly stealthy. He kept his eyes angled downward, masking his intrusion under the guise of reading sports statistics. I had spent the last week seeding that decoy phone with a goldmine of fabricated insecurity. He was currently scrolling through a highly detailed fake text thread between me and a non-existent college friend named Sarah. He read messages where I complained bitterly about failing at my new job. He read paragraphs where I whined that the financial software was far too complicated for me to understand. He read frantic, anxious texts where I expressed deep fear that my manager was going to fire me by Friday for being completely clueless about corporate accounts. A micro-expression of pure, unadulterated satisfaction rippled across Gavin's face. The tension melted from his jaw, and his shoulders relaxed into the leather booth. He had found exactly what he wanted to find. He saw a weak, incompetent wife who was entirely consumed by her own pathetic professional failures, completely blind to the millions of dollars moving around her. He saw a woman who possessed neither the intellect nor the suspicion to uncover his grand deception. He was so intensely engrossed in reading my fake misery that he completely ignored my movements. I leaned across the table, extending my arm toward the small silver salt shaker positioned near his side of the booth. My hand hovered within inches of his discarded suit jacket, which he had draped over the empty chair beside him. With a swift, practiced motion, honed through hours of repetition, I slipped a microscopic magnetic GPS tracker directly into the inner lining of his lapel pocket. It caught the dark wool fabric with a silent, invisible grip. I pulled my hand back casually, sprinkling salt over my risotto. Gavin slid the phone back across the table, offering a bright, sympathetic smile. "Your team won," he announced smoothly, completely unaware that his own team was already dead on the field. He signaled the waiter and ordered a lavish chocolate soufflé, raising his wine glass to toast to our future. I raised my glass to his smiling back with equal warmth. He believed he had executed a masterclass in deception. He believed he was flying to Aspen tomorrow morning as a free, wealthy man, leaving behind a clueless wife who would never see the knife coming. He had no idea he was now a walking beacon. He did not know that his jacket was currently broadcasting his exact coordinates to my private encrypted server, ensuring that I would track his every single movement straight to his wedding altar. The next morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill that felt perfectly suited for the occasion. I stood on the sweeping front steps of my parents' sprawling estate, holding a heavy black trash bag. The grand circular driveway was a chaotic scene of manufactured luxury and frantic, self-important packing. Thomas and Barbara were aggressively directing the hired help, pointing with exasperated sighs as a mountain of matching designer luggage was loaded into the back of an airport shuttle van. Gavin stood near the passenger door, looking effortlessly handsome in a tailored cashmere overcoat. He gave me a quick, practiced peck on the cheek, repeating the lie that he would call me the second he landed in Colorado. I smiled, playing the dutiful, oblivious wife to perfection, while my secure phone vibrated silently in my pocket. It was a fresh location ping from the tracker nestled deeply in his lapel. Cassidy strutted down the front steps, her oversized designer sunglasses masking half her face. She paused beside me, her eyes sweeping over my faded jeans and oversized sweater with undisguised pity and disgust. "Make sure you scrub the driveway while we are gone," Cassidy sneered, adjusting her silk scarf with a sharp tug. "The caterers for next week's charity gala cannot be greeted by oil stains. Try to make yourself useful for once, Diana. We cannot all just sit around staring at spreadsheets." Tyrone let out a booming, arrogant laugh from the driver's side of his luxury SUV. He checked his watch, deliberately angling his wrist so the morning sun would catch the diamond bezel of his massive gold Rolex. I recognized that watch immediately. I had traced the exact dummy vendor account he used to embezzle the funds to purchase it. "Better get started early, Diana," Tyrone mocked, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Manual labor takes time, and we all know you are not exactly a fast worker." I simply lowered my gaze and nodded obediently, clutching the plastic trash bag tighter against my side. For 27 years, this submissive posture had been my primary survival mechanism. I had learned early in childhood that shrinking myself, swallowing my pride, and accepting their casual cruelty was the only way to exist within this family without triggering explosive emotional warfare. They expected me to be small. They required me to be silent. I had spent nearly 3 decades absorbing their insults, allowing them to use my perceived weakness to elevate their own fragile egos. But that version of Diana was entirely dead. The quiet woman nodding on the porch was merely a ghost, a perfectly calibrated projection designed to keep them utterly complacent. The irony of Cassidy ordering me to scrub a driveway she no longer legally owned almost made me laugh aloud. Silas had finalized the proxy acquisition of their toxic mortgages just hours ago. The aggressive foreclosure countdown had already silently begun. "Have a wonderful trip," I said, my voice soft and deliberately meek. Barbara did not even bother to look in my direction as she climbed into the van. Thomas offered a dismissive backward wave before shutting the heavy door. I watched as the caravan of luxury vehicles pulled out of the grand driveway, their taillights flashing red as they turned onto the main road. I stood completely still on the concrete steps, waiting until the faint hum of their engines completely faded into the crisp morning air. The moment they disappeared from view, the dutiful, submissive posture instantly vanished from my shoulders. I dropped the heavy trash bag directly onto the pristine driveway. I turned and walked back inside the empty mansion, the silence of the massive house echoing around me. The air felt entirely different now. It was the absolute calm before a catastrophic storm. I walked straight up the sweeping mahogany staircase and entered the guest suite I had been relegated to for the past year. I opened the antique armoire and reached past the rows of drab, sensible work clothes they expected me to wear. From the very back, I pulled out a protective garment bag and unzipped it, revealing a stunning, meticulously tailored crimson gown. The heavy silk caught the morning light, radiating power, defiance, and undeniable danger. It was not the dress of a boring data cruncher. It was the armor of an executioner. I laid the gown across the bed and pulled my secure forensic phone from my pocket. I opened the encrypted tracking application linked to the micro GPS I had slipped into Gavin's jacket last night. A detailed digital map populated on the screen, a pulsing red dot indicating his exact location in real time. I watched the dot move steadily along the interstate, tracking their so-called journey to the private airfield. But the dot did not head toward the airport. It bypassed the exit entirely. I zoomed in on the map, a cold, predatory smile spreading across my face. They were not flying to Aspen. They had never intended to leave the state. The red dot was moving directly toward the Belmont estate. It was an ultra-exclusive, deeply secluded luxury resort located just 2 hours away in the dense mountains. The Belmont was a notorious playground for the corporate elite, a sprawling modern castle that charged exorbitant fees in exchange for absolute privacy and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. They had fabricated the entire Colorado destination wedding narrative to ensure I would not accidentally stumble upon the venue, intercept a caterer, or question the guest list. They wanted to keep their lavish crime scene close to home, likely paying for the extravagant venue in cash generated from Tyrone's heavily leveraged lines of credit. It was a brilliant, arrogant logistical move. It meant they did not have to deal with the complexities of moving stolen money across state lines for vendors. It also meant they were geographically trapped. I tapped the screen, locking the destination coordinates into my own navigation system. The timing was absolutely perfect. Director Vance had already forwarded the irrefutable evidence of Heather's cybercrime to his contacts at the Department of Justice. The digital watermarks I embedded in the decoy files were currently broadcasting Heather's exact location directly to federal agents. I unzipped the crimson gown and began to prepare. I applied my makeup with sharp, precise strokes, abandoning the muted tones I usually wore for a striking, unapologetic look. I pinned my hair back, securing it tightly. I slipped into the gown, the heavy silk conforming perfectly to my frame. I looked into the full-length mirror and did not recognize the woman staring back. The subservient daughter was gone. The betrayed wife had been erased. I was the architect of their destruction, and I was about to crash a wedding. The 2-hour drive through the winding forested mountain roads gave me ample time to appreciate the sheer scale of their deception. The Belmont estate was not just a venue. It was an absolute fortress of exclusivity hidden behind miles of private roads and dense old-growth pine trees. It was the kind of place that did not advertise, relying entirely on wealth and whispered recommendations among the corporate elite. Booking this estate required a minimum of $500,000 upfront, a sum that Tyrone and Gavin had undoubtedly siphoned directly from my parents' fraudulent underwater mortgages. I bypassed the grand main entrance, ignoring the line of luxury imports waiting for the valet. Instead, I steered my practical, unremarkable sedan toward the service road, parking near the loading dock. I knew how these high society events operated. Security was heavily concentrated at the front gates to keep out the paparazzi and the uninvited public, but the service corridors were always a chaotic hive of caterers, florists, and event staff. Moving with the quiet, authoritative purpose of someone who belonged there, I slipped through the kitchen entrance. The frantic energy of the kitchen staff masked my arrival perfectly. No one questioned the woman walking with absolute terrifying determination toward the grand conservatory. I paused in the shadowed velvet-lined hallway just outside the main event space. The heavy carved oak doors were slightly ajar, allowing the sounds of the rehearsal dinner to drift into the corridor. The atmosphere was dripping with manufactured opulence. A string quartet was playing a flawless, elegant rendition of Vivaldi. The melodic clinking of crystal glasses and the low, self-important hum of wealthy conversation filled the air. I stood in the shadows and observed the room. It was a masterpiece of stolen money. Massive floral arrangements cascaded from the vaulted ceilings. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos glided through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and glasses of vintage champagne. And right in the center of the room, standing beneath a cascading crystal chandelier, were my parents. Thomas and Barbara were holding court with an older, impeccably dressed couple I recognized instantly from Vanguard Financial's elite client portfolio. They were Heather's parents, the billionaire real estate magnates. I listened as my father laughed heartily, clapping Heather's father on the shoulder with practiced aristocratic familiarity. "Gavin is an absolute prodigy," Thomas boasted loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the surrounding guests. "The way he manages our family's portfolio is nothing short of visionary. His market instincts are entirely unparalleled. You are gaining a spectacular son-in-law, Richard, a man of true ambition and flawless pedigree." Barbara nodded enthusiastically, her diamond earrings catching the light. "And Heather is just the perfect match for him. They belong in this world together. It is such a relief Gavin finally found someone on his level, someone who understands the demands of high society. The implication was crystal clear. To my family, I was the starter wife. I was the boring blue-collar mistake that Gavin had to outgrow. They were standing in a room paid for by a criminal syndicate, sipping champagne bought with stolen money, and proudly rewriting history to erase me from existence. They were securing their place in Heather's billionaire family by offering Gavin up as a prize. I placed my hands flat against the heavy brass handles of the oak doors. I did not knock. I did not wait for an invitation. I pushed the doors open with a heavy resonant thud that echoed over the string quartet. I stepped fully into the light of the grand conservatory. The crimson silk of my tailored gown caught the glow of the chandeliers, radiating a vibrant blood-red intensity that demanded absolute attention. I stood tall, my shoulders pulled back, my spine made of steel. I was no longer the submissive practical daughter they could order to scrub their driveway. I was the sole legal creditor of their entire existence. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. The cellist noticed me first, his bow slipping off the strings with a harsh, discordant screech. The music faltered and died. Conversations evaporated mid-sentence. The melodic clinking of glasses ceased entirely. The silence spread outward from the doorway, like a shockwave rippling through the crowd, until the massive room was dead silent, every single eye locked onto me. I found Gavin in the crowd. The blood drained from his face with such violent speed he looked like a corpse. His jaw went slack, his perfectly styled hair suddenly seeming out of place above his terrified eyes. Beside him, Heather stared at me in sheer, unadulterated horror. Her fingers went limp. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp and shattered against the marble floor, the sharp explosive sound echoing through the silent room like a gunshot. She knew I was supposed to be ruined. She knew her digital trap was supposed to have fired me by now. Seeing me standing there wearing a gown that cost more than her engagement ring shattered her entire reality. My parents froze. Their polite society smiles twisted into grotesque masks of absolute panic. Thomas took a step backward, physically retreating from the ghost of the daughter he thought he had discarded. Barbara clutched her pearl necklace, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Tyrone stood near the bar, his arrogant smirk melting into an expression of profound cornered fear. Cassidy was the only one who moved. Her survival instinct, honed by a lifetime of bullying and dominating me, kicked into overdrive. She could not comprehend the shift in power. She only saw the target she had abused for 27 years ruining her perfect evening. Cassidy marched across the marble floor, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the stone. She closed the distance between us, her face flushed with fury. Cassidy reached out and grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging sharply into my skin. She leaned in close, her expensive perfume masking the stench of her panic. "Are you psychotic?" Cassidy hissed, her voice a venomous, desperate whisper meant only for me. "Get out of here before I have security throw you onto the street." I did not shrink back. I did not lower my eyes. I did not offer the obedient nod she expected. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then I looked directly into her terrified eyes. With a swift, fluid, and entirely effortless motion, I twisted my arm upward, breaking her grip instantly. Cassidy stumbled backward, her eyes widening in shock at my physical defiance. I reached out and smoothly took a full champagne flute from the tray of a frozen, wide-eyed waiter standing nearby. I turned my attention back to the crowd raising the crystal glass high into the air. "I wouldn't do that, Cass," I said, my voice projecting clearly and flawlessly across the silent, breathless room. "I'm here to give a toast." The crystal flute felt perfectly balanced in my hand. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the crisp, expensive champagne slide down my throat as the entire grand conservatory held its collective breath. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the scent of imported orchids and sudden, overwhelming dread. I had just stepped through the heavy oak doors, wrapped in a crimson silk gown that radiated unapologetic power, instantly shattering the carefully curated elegance of their high society rehearsal dinner. Before I could utter another word, my mother shattered the quiet. Barbara surged forward from the head table, her face a blotchy, furious red that clashed horribly with her emerald evening gown. She shoved past a paralyzed waiter, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate rage. She was completely unequipped to process my defiance. "You ungrateful wretch!" Barbara hissed, her voice vibrating with years of unchecked toxicity carrying clearly across the silent room. "You just couldn't stand seeing your sister and brother-in-law happy. You are a stain on this family." Her accusation made perfect twisted sense within the sick logic of our family dynamic. Cassidy and Tyrone had brokered this entire fraudulent union. They had introduced Gavin to Heather, using my husband as a corporate pawn to secure their own access to Richard's billionaire real estate empire. My presence here was not just a threat to Gavin's bigamous wedding. It was a direct threat to the massive financial kickbacks and social elevation Cassidy and Tyrone were expecting to receive for facilitating the match. I was jeopardizing their elite payout, and in my mother's eyes, disrupting her golden child's happiness was the ultimate unforgivable sin. I did not flinch at her insult. I simply shifted my cold gaze past my mother's trembling shoulders to the head table. Gavin looked as though the marble floor had simply vanished beneath his feet. The polished, charismatic corporate shark had been entirely replaced by a cornered, terrified animal. The blood drained from his face with such violent speed, he looked sickly translucent. He lunged forward, grabbing Heather's forearm in a frantic grip, trying to physically pull her away from the center of the room. He knew exactly what I was capable of, and his survival instinct was screaming at him to flee. "We need to leave," Gavin stammered, his voice cracking loudly. "Heather, we need to go right now." But Heather anchored her designer heels into the floor, ripping her arm violently out of his grasp. She possessed the fierce, blind arrogance of a woman who had never been denied anything in her life. She glared at me, her eyes sweeping over my tailored crimson gown with frantic, desperate contempt. She recognized me instantly from the Vanguard break room, the plain, submissive accountant she had mocked just days prior. She still believed she held the upper hand, completely oblivious to the federal cyber trap I had already sprung on her. "Who let this Vanguard loser in here?" Heather screamed, her shrill voice echoing sharply off the vaulted ceilings. She turned to the frozen security guards near the grand entrance. "Throw her out. She is a crazy employee obsessed with my fiancé." Her fiancé. The word hung in the air, pathetic and absurd. I stepped smoothly around my mother, closing the distance to the head table. The crowd of wealthy elites parted for me like the Red Sea. Cassidy rushed forward, her face twisted in a panicked snarl, grabbing my arm with her manicured nails. "Are you psychotic? Get out of here before I have security throw you onto the street." I easily twisted out of Cassidy's grip, my movements fluid and practiced. I raised the champagne flute I had commandeered from the waiter. "I wouldn't do that, Cass," I said, my voice projecting with flawless authority. "I'm here to give a toast." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small black universal remote. I had intercepted the AV technician in the service corridor moments before pushing through the doors, relieving him of his equipment with a crisp $100 bill and a polite request to take an early break. I raised the remote, pointing it directly at the massive projector screen positioned behind the head table. The screen was currently displaying a sickeningly sweet slideshow of Gavin and Heather. High-resolution images of them kissing on yachts, skiing in the Alps, and toasting with champagne flashed in a continuous loop. It was a carefully curated display of their stolen luxury. I smiled, my thumb resting on the central button. "You always did love a good presentation, Gavin." I pressed the button. The romantic montage of their vacations instantly vanished. The screen went pitch black for a fraction of a second before a new high-definition image illuminated the entire room. It was not a photograph. It was a scanned, legally binding document magnified to 10 feet tall. Every signature, every official state seal, and every date was crystal clear. It was my active marriage certificate. It explicitly listed Diana and Gavin as legally wedded spouses. "Surprise, Heather," I said, turning to face her with a cold, razor-sharp smile. "You're marrying a currently married man." A collective, deafening gasp erupted from the high society guests. The sound of 100 wealthy socialites simultaneously realizing they were attending a criminal enterprise was a symphony. Heather's billionaire father, Richard, dropped his crystal glass. It shattered against the floor, but no one moved to clean it up. The color drained from Richard's face as he stared at the massive, indisputable proof of Gavin's deception. He was a man who prided himself on vetting everyone in his orbit. and he had just realized a mid-level corporate grifter had successfully infiltrated his family and humiliated him in front of his peers. Gavin took a step back, his hands raised defensively, sputtering fragmented, incoherent syllables. "It is fake!" He finally choked out, his voice shrill and desperate, vibrating with panic. "Richard, Heather, I swear to you, it is a forgery. She is a disgruntled employee. She works in my accounting department." I took another step forward, setting my champagne flute down on the pristine white tablecloth. "It is a matter of public record, easily verified by anyone in this room, with an internet connection and 30 seconds of free time," I replied smoothly. "And you are exactly right, Gavin. I do work in your accounting department, which is precisely how I know about the offshore accounts, the forged ledgers, and the dummy corporations you and Tyrone have been using to siphon Vanguard client funds to pay for this very venue." Heather turned to Gavin, her face twisting in pure horror as the reality of my words sank in. "Gavin, tell me she is lying." Gavin reached for her again, but Richard intercepted him. The older man stepped firmly between his daughter and the man she thought she was going to marry. "Do not touch her," Richard growled, his voice radiating a dangerous, quiet authority. Cassidy marched up beside our mother, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You have lost your mind, Diana. You are ruining everything. You are destroying this family out of pure, bitter jealousy." "I am not destroying anything, Cass," I said, turning my gaze to my sister, relishing the absolute terror in her eyes. "I am simply shining a light on the rot that has been here all along. You and Tyrone thought you could use my husband as a stepping stone. You thought you could facilitate this bigamous wedding, secure your connections to Richard's real estate empire, and leave me footing the bill. You thought I would just sit quietly at my desk scrubbing your driveway while you spent my stolen money." I looked over at Tyrone. He was standing near the bar, frantically texting on his phone, his face pale and sweating. He was likely trying to move funds or contact his defense attorneys. "I wouldn't bother Tyrone," I called out to him, ensuring the entire room could hear me. "Silas completed the proxy acquisition of your underwater mortgages 2 hours ago. The foreclosure proceedings have already been initiated. Your luxury SUV, that diamond Rolex, this entire lifestyle, it is all gone." Tyrone froze, the phone slipping from his hands and clattering to the floor. The room descended into utter chaos. Guests were whispering furiously, pulling out their own phones to gossip or call their brokers. The elegant rehearsal dinner had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. My mother was hyperventilating, clutching Thomas's arm as the reality of their massive public humiliation set in. They had spent decades curating an image of perfection, of untouchable high society grace. Now they were standing in the center of a spectacular criminal implosion, exposed to the exact people they desperately wanted to impress. I stood amidst the wreckage, feeling entirely calm. The subservient ghost they had bullied for 27 years was officially dead and buried. Gavin broke the silence with a sound that was half gasp and half shriek. The polished, charismatic financial advisor had completely evaporated, leaving behind a frantic, cornered imposter. His chest heaved violently under his expensive tailored jacket. He stepped directly into the path of the projector, letting the harsh white light of our active marriage certificate wash over his face, attempting to physically block the truth from the high society guests, staring in absolute horror. "She is completely insane," Gavin yelled, turning desperately toward Richard, holding his palms open in a pleading, subservient gesture. He was sweating profusely, the moisture ruining his perfectly styled hair. "I swear to you, Richard, she is crazy. I signed the divorce papers. We finalized the separation months ago. She is just a bitter, obsessed woman who refuses to accept reality. I have the waiver to prove it." Richard did not move a single muscle. The billionaire real estate magnate simply stared at Gavin, his expression hardening into a mask of lethal aristocratic disgust. Heather was weeping openly now, her hands covering her face, as the whispers of her wealthy peers echoed off the vaulted glass ceilings of the grand conservatory. "I have the proof right here," Gavin stammered, plunging his shaking hand into his pocket. He ripped his smartphone out, nearly dropping the sleek device onto the marble floor. "I have the legally binding post-nuptial waiver. She signed it in my office. She relinquished every single claim to my assets and formally acknowledged the termination of our marital status. I digitized the scan myself." Gavin frantically swiped at his screen, his thumb slipping against the glass as panic destroyed his fine motor skills. He navigated to his secure cloud storage application, his breath hitching with desperate relief as he located the file. He thrust the illuminated phone screen directly into Richard's face. Heather leaned in her tear-streaked face, hovering over her father's shoulder. The surrounding guests, including my own horrified parents, leaned in closer, straining their necks to inspect the digital evidence of my supposed defeat. I stood perfectly still, smoothing the fabric of my crimson gown, and watched a collective wave of absolute bewilderment wash over their faces. Richard squinted at the screen, his thick eyebrows knitting together in deep, furious ridges. He did not look relieved, he looked insulted. "There is nothing here, Gavin," Richard growled, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the dangerous weight of a man accustomed to destroying his enemies. "What are you talking about?" Gavin snatched the phone back, staring at the bright screen. His eyes widened to the size of saucers. He tapped the glass, frantically zooming in on the bottom of the scanned legal document. The dense, aggressive legal text was perfectly legible, outlining his ruthless terms of separation and total asset protection. But the signature line at the very bottom was completely, undeniably blank. There was no ink. There was no authorization. The notary seal beside it was rendered entirely void without a signature to witness. The digital file he was proudly showing the room was a worthless, unexecuted piece of paper. Gavin's jaw dropped open. He stared at the blank white space as if his brain simply could not process the visual data. He tapped the screen again, scrolling wildly up and down the document, searching for a signature that did not exist. He did not know about the specialized thermal degrading pen I had purchased from a tactical espionage supplier online. 2 weeks prior, I had sat in his immaculate home office, weeping manufactured tears, while I signed away my financial future. I had let him snatch the paper from my trembling hands with a triumphant, condescending sneer. He had immediately run the document through his high-speed, laser-heated office scanner to digitize the file for his corporate lawyers. I knew the exact operating temperature of that specific scanner model. I knew the intense thermal exposure from the glass would react violently with the chemical compound in the customized ink. The heat had erased my signature permanently and instantly. I had legally signed nothing, leaving our marriage perfectly intact. "It was right here!" Gavin shrieked, his voice echoing shrilly across the room. He tapped the phone glass so hard it sounded like it might shatter. "She signed it. I watched her sign it with my own eyes." "You are showing me a blank page, you absolute fraud," Richard stated. He took a deliberate, highly visible step away from Gavin, physically severing his association with the disgraced accountant. Heather let out a loud, humiliated sob and buried her face in her father's shoulder. My mother, Barbara, attempted a desperate, foolish intervention. She stepped forward, her hands raised in a placating gesture, her face stretched into a terrified, placating grin. "Richard, please, there must be a clerical error. Diana has always been deeply unstable and vindictive. She is obviously manipulating the technology to cause a scene." "Shut up, Barbara," I commanded. The sharpness of my voice snapped through the opulent room like a physical strike. My mother visibly recoiled, her mouth snapping shut instantly. She had never heard me raise my voice in 27 years. The sheer shock of my unapologetic defiance paralyzed her completely. Cassidy cowered behind her, her usual vicious bravado entirely erased by the magnitude of the social disaster unfolding around her. That was when Tyrone decided to take control. He pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his massive frame radiating aggressive, volatile intimidation. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his tight shirt collar. He recognized that the situation was rapidly devolving from a social embarrassment into a severe financial and legal liability. If my marriage was active, his embezzlement pipeline was totally exposed. He had to neutralize the threat immediately before Richard started asking questions about the venue funding. Tyrone, furious and sweating, stepped up. He closed the distance between us, trying to use his sheer physical size to force me back into submission. He pointed a thick, aggressive finger directly at my face. "You're trespassing, Diana!" Tyrone barked, his voice dripping with condescension and rage. "You have no money, no power, and no proof of anything. I'm having you arrested." He reached for his phone, aggressively flashing his stolen diamond Rolex under the chandelier light one last time, a desperate attempt to assert his dominance over a woman he firmly believed was destitute and powerless. I stood my ground, looking up at his red, sweating face. I let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. The sound cut through the heavy, suffocating tension in the room, causing Tyrone to falter. His pointing finger lowered slightly, genuine confusion breaking through his arrogant rage. "Oh, Tyrone," I said, my voice echoing with icy, calculated triumph. "I was hoping you'd say that." I raised the black universal remote, aiming it squarely at the giant projector screen, and clicked the button again. The marriage certificate vanished from the giant screen. The projector plunged into absolute darkness for a fraction of a second, before a pulsing neon green digital audio waveform illuminated the room. The Belmont Estate's state-of-the-art surround sound system, previously calibrated for the gentle melodic hum of a live string quartet, suddenly amplified the incoming audio file to a deafening, inescapable volume. The recording crackled slightly before Tyrone's voice boomed across the grand conservatory. It was thick with arrogant greed, captured perfectly by the micro-recorder I had taped beneath the center console of his luxury SUV weeks prior. "Just forged Diana's signature on the $5 million trust." Tyrone's voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "The stupid girl will never know. She does not even read the paperwork I hand her." The room inhaled sharply, but the audio was not finished. My own father's voice answered him. Thomas sounded crisp, authoritative, and utterly devoid of paternal affection. It was the calculated tone of a man negotiating a hostile corporate takeover, not discussing the financial ruin of his own daughter. "Make sure the transfer is seamless, Tyrone," Thomas commanded from the speakers. "Put it directly into Gavin's shell company. We need that capital to secure the Belmont deposit immediately and keep Richard completely in the dark regarding our actual liquidity. Do not leave a paper trail linking back to my accounts." The recording clicked off, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating silence. The sound of their casual, calculated financial treason hung in the air, a toxic cloud that poisoned the entire venue. I watched my father stagger backward. His hand flew to his chest, gripping the lapel of his expensive tuxedo as his knees visibly buckled. For a man who worshipped his public image above all else, having his voice broadcast a federal confession to a room packed with billionaires was a literal cardiac event. His carefully constructed facade of the wealthy, respectable patriarch was actively burning to the ground in front of his elite peers. Barbara turned the color of chalk. The artificial high society smile melted off her face, leaving behind the terrified, hollow expression of a woman who just realized her country club membership was about to be permanently replaced with a federal indictment. She reached out to steady her husband, but her hands were shaking too violently to be of any use. The high society guests reacted with brutal, self-preserving efficiency. The wealthy elite do not tolerate messy public criminality. It is a contagion they aggressively avoid. Men in bespoke suits and women draped in couture gowns began stepping backward in unison. Within seconds, a wide, empty circle formed around my family. They were suddenly entirely isolated on the marble floor, quarantined like a terminal disease. Heather, sensing her entire world collapsing, turned violently on Gavin. Her survival instinct demanded she sever herself from the sinking ship immediately. Her tear-streaked face twisted with pure aristocratic rage. She needed the room to view her as just another tragic victim of Gavin's elaborate deception. "You used stolen money to buy my ring," Heather screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. She raised her hand and swung it through the air with astonishing speed. The massive diamond engagement ring caught the chandelier light a fraction of a second before she delivered a sharp, resounding slap across Gavin's cheek. The crack of skin against skin rang out sharply, echoing through the silent room. Gavin stumbled sideways, clutching his face, utterly paralyzed by the implosion of his master plan. "You dragged me into this pathetic, low-class scheme," Heather shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "You lied to me. My father will destroy you. You are nothing but a common thief." I stood near the head table, holding my black remote, watching her performative outrage with absolute disgust. She was playing the innocent, deceived bride, flawlessly banking on her family's wealth to shield her from the fallout. "You can drop the innocent victim routine right now, Heather," I said, my voice slicing through her manufactured hysteria. You are not a casualty in this situation. You are a willing co-conspirator. Heather whipped her head toward me, her eyes flashing with indignant fury. Her chest heaved as she pointed that same trembling finger at me. How dare you speak to me? I am a victim. I knew nothing about his fake marriage or his stolen money. I smiled, a cold, predatory curve of my lips. I raised my arm, aiming the remote at the projector for the third time. I pressed the button. The screen shifted instantly from the green audio waveform to a stark scrolling wall of technical data. It was a direct, irrefutable export of the Vanguard financial server logs. Lines of glowing white text cascaded down the massive black screen, highlighting a massive, unauthorized data breach in glaring red letters. That is your specific employee identification number. Heather, I announced, projecting my voice so every single guest, especially her father, could hear the undeniable truth. That is your exact workstation MAC address. And that is the precise timestamp from yesterday afternoon when you used my stolen credentials to illegally download highly classified client financial portfolios to an external drive. Heather's mouth fell open, but no sound emerged. The remaining color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. Richard stared at the screen, his jaw tight, his eyes widening as he comprehended the catastrophic magnitude of his daughter's actions. You thought you were wiping the ledgers to cover Gavin's tracks and frame me for corporate espionage. I continued, stepping closer to her, ensuring she felt the full weight of her actions. You thought you were so much smarter than the boring data cruncher, but you actually downloaded heavily monitored, federally watermarked decoy files. The moment you unplugged your flash drive, active tracing scripts executed. I paused, letting the silence amplify the final blow. You did not just steal files, Heather. You sent a signed digital confession featuring your exact location directly to the FBI Cyber Crimes Division. By the time this dinner is over, federal agents will be waiting for you. The sheer, suffocating finality of my words hit Heather with the force of a physical blow. Her legs gave out entirely. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor, her expensive silk gown pooling around her in a chaotic, wrinkled mess. She looked up at her father, her eyes wide with a desperate, silent plea for him to fix this, to buy her way out of federal prosecution, just as he had bought her way out of every other inconvenience in her life. But Richard did not reach down to help his daughter. He did not offer a word of comfort. The billionaire simply adjusted his cuffs, pulled his phone from his breast pocket, and signaled for his private security detail to step away from the head table. He was officially abandoning the blast radius. Gavin fell to his knees beside Heather, his breath hitching in ragged, pathetic gasps. He clutched his hair, rocking back and forth, as the reality of his destroyed life finally crushed him. The fake post-nuptial agreement, the bigamous marriage, the stolen corporate funds, every single lie had been systematically dismantled and weaponized against him. But Tyrone did not collapse. Tyrone was a street-level grifter who had clawed his way into high society through ruthlessness and intimidation. When backed into a corner, his only instinct was violence. The realization that I had frozen his assets, foreclosed his properties, and publicly exposed his fraud triggered a terrifying, explosive rage. The veins in his forehead throbbed. His eyes went entirely black with murderous intent. He let out a guttural, furious roar that rattled the crystal glassware on the tables. Tyrone lunged at me. He shoved past my paralyzed mother, knocking her hard into the side of a floral arrangement. He charged across the open space, his massive fists clenched tight, his heavy shoulders dropping as he prepared to tackle me to the floor. Guests screamed, scrambling backward in a panicked stampede to avoid his path of destruction. Cassidy shrieked his name, reaching out to grab the back of his tuxedo jacket, but he ripped out of her grasp effortlessly. "I will kill you!" Tyrone bellowed, the spittle flying from his lips as he closed the final few feet between us. "You little—" I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I did not break eye contact with the massive, enraged man barreling toward me. With practiced, absolute precision, I reached my left hand into my crimson clutch. My fingers wrapped around cold, heavy metal. I ripped my hand upward in a blindingly fast arc and slammed the object directly onto the polished mahogany surface of the head table. It hit the wood with a sharp, resonant clatter that cut through the screaming crowd like a gunshot. Tyrone froze. His forward momentum abruptly died. His expensive leather shoes skidded against the marble floor as he stopped mere inches from me. He stared down at the object resting on the table between us. It was a heavy metallic badge housed in a reinforced leather wallet. The bright gold eagle and the stark, deeply engraved lettering caught the glow of the overhead chandeliers. It bore the unmistakable seal of a federal forensic investigator. The silence that fell over the Grand Conservatory was absolute. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of a room full of people realizing they had just witnessed a masterclass in deception. Tyrone's eyes bulged. He stared at the badge, then slowly looked up at my face. The murderous rage in his eyes was instantly replaced by profound, paralyzing terror. He took a stumbling step backward, his hands rising defensively into the air. "I am not just a data cruncher, Tyrone," I said, my voice cutting through the dead silence with cold, lethal authority. "I am the lead forensic analyst contracted by the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and you just confessed to federal wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny in a room full of witnesses." I turned my gaze away from the shaking, sweating man and looked directly at my parents. Barbara was clinging to the edge of a table, her face a mask of absolute, uncomprehending shock. Thomas looked as though he was struggling to breathe, his hand still clutched tightly against his chest. "For 5 years," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the room, "you told your country club friends that I was a glorified secretary. You mocked my practical clothes, my quiet apartment, and my boring corporate job. You told Cassidy she was the success story of this family because she married a man with a flashy car and an offshore bank account. You never once bothered to ask what my actual job title was. You never asked what I actually did at Vanguard Financial." I stepped around the table, picking up my badge and snapping the leather wallet closed with a sharp final click. If you had ever shown a fraction of the interest in me that you showed in Cassidy's designer handbags, you would have known that I do not file tax returns. I hunt financial syndicates. I dismantle shell corporations. I trace stolen money across international borders for the federal government. Vanguard Financial was my assignment. Gavin was just a convenient, arrogant mark who thought he could outsmart the quiet woman in the break room. Cassidy let out a loud, strangled sob. She looked at Tyrone, then looked at me, her entire reality shattering in real time. She was not a wealthy socialite. She was the wife of a completely ruined, federally indicted felon. "You set us up," Thomas gasped out, his voice a ragged, terrified whisper. He stepped toward me, his hands trembling. "Diana, you trapped your own family. That audio recording, you implicated me. I am your father. You cannot do this." "You implicated yourself, Thomas," I replied, my tone devoid of any familial warmth. "You chose to leverage your own daughter's marriage to steal millions. You chose to protect Gavin's bigamous wedding because it elevated your social standing. You made your choices with absolute clarity. Now you get to experience the consequences with absolute clarity." Barbara let out a high-pitched wailing cry. "Diana, please. We will give the money back. We will cancel the wedding. Just put that badge away and let us go home." "Nobody is going home, Barbara," I said. Right on cue, the heavy, rhythmic sound of tactical boots echoed from the estate's massive stone courtyard. The sharp, piercing wail of approaching sirens cut through the night air, growing louder and more intense by the second. Vivid flashes of red and blue light began to strobe through the tall glass windows of the Grand Conservatory, casting violent, frantic shadows across the faces of the terrified guests. The federal strike team had arrived. The heavy oak doors I had pushed open just moments ago were violently thrown wide. A dozen tactical agents flooded the Grand Conservatory, moving with a synchronized, terrifying efficiency that instantly drained whatever defiant oxygen remained in the room. They wore black tactical gear, their radios crackling with terse, coded commands. The blinding sweep of their mounted flashlights completely eclipsed the soft, romantic glow of the crystal chandeliers. The stark contrast between the violent reality of federal law enforcement and the manufactured opulence of a billionaire rehearsal dinner was absolute. The melodic clinking of crystal glasses was replaced by the heavy rhythmic thud of combat boots marching across the pristine marble floor. Panic is a highly predictable mechanism. Tyrone, the street-level grifter disguised in a bespoke tuxedo, abandoned his aggressive posturing the very second he registered the raid jackets. His survival instinct overrode his arrogance completely. He shoved past my paralyzed mother, sending her stumbling sideways into a massive floral arrangement, and bolted toward the kitchen service corridor. Gavin, finally shaken out of his catatonic shock by the sudden violence, scrambled frantically right behind him. The polished corporate shark, who had spent years legally insulating himself behind shell companies and offshore accounts, was now just a terrified, desperate man slipping wildly on expensive Italian leather shoes. They did not make it far. The kitchen doors burst open from the other side. A secondary tactical unit had already secured the service entrances, anticipating the exact escape route cowardly men always choose. Tyrone, blinded by adrenaline, tried to throw a heavy, desperate punch at the lead agent blocking his path. It was a spectacular miscalculation. The agent deflected the sloppy blow effortlessly, stepping inside Tyrone's guard and sweeping his legs entirely out from under him. The massive man hit the polished marble floor with a sickening heavy thud that vibrated through the soles of my heels. Two agents immediately pinned him down a heavy tactical knee, pressing directly between his shoulder blades to neutralize his thrashing weight. Gavin did not even attempt to put up a physical fight. He tripped over Tyrone's flailing legs and crashed face first onto the hard stone. An agent was on him in a fraction of a second, grabbing his wrists and twisting his arms violently behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of handcuffs echoing over the string quartet's abandoned instruments was the final definitive end to their corporate syndicate. The untouchable golden boys of my family's elite social circle, the men they had proudly chosen over me, were now pressed face down against the cold floor, gasping for air under the crushing weight of federal authority. Across the room, a female agent approached the head table with calm, predatory focus. Heather was backing away, her hands raised defensively, her expensive silk gown tangling around her ankles and restricting her movements. She looked frantically toward the shadows where her father had been standing just moments prior. But Richard had already stepped further back, flanked entirely by his private security detail. The billionaire real estate magnate was ruthlessly cutting his losses, abandoning his daughter to protect his own corporate empire from the radioactive fallout of her highly publicized crimes. "Heather Sterling," the agent stated, her voice projecting a flat, emotionless authority that cut through the ambient panic. "You are under arrest for corporate espionage, unauthorized access to a protected federal database, and tampering with digital evidence." Heather let out a guttural, terrifying scream. She thrashed wildly, her manicured nails clawing at the air as the agent efficiently secured her wrists in heavy plastic zip ties. "Do you know who my father is?" she shrieked, her voice cracking as mascara-stained tears ruined her pristine face. "I am innocent. He made me do it. Gavin told me it was just a routine corporate audit. Daddy, help me." The agent ignored her hysterical pleas entirely calmly, reciting her Miranda rights over the deafening sobs. Heather's entire life of absolute privilege, a life spent destroying people like me for pure sport, evaporated the exact moment those plastic cuffs tightened around her wrists. The high society guests were completely silent now, watching the brutal destruction of the Sterling and Belmont empires with morbid, self-preserving fascination. They were already mentally rewriting their own histories, calculating exactly how to distance their personal brands from Thomas and Barbara. And then there was my mother. Barbara had watched her golden son-in-law get tackled to the ground like a common criminal. She had watched her wealthy connections sever ties in real time, physically backing away from her, as if she were carrying a plague. The grand illusion she had sacrificed my entire childhood to construct was dead. The social elevation she had craved so desperately was replaced by imminent federal prosecution. She collapsed to her knees, her emerald evening gown pooled around her on the marble, soaking up the spilled champagne from Richard's shattered glass. She looked up at me, her face completely stripped of the aristocratic arrogance she had worn like armor for 27 years. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving with desperate, jagged breaths as her perfectly styled hair fell in frantic wisps around her face. She began to crawl toward me, The matriarch of the family, the woman who had ordered me to scrub the driveway so her elite guests would not have to look at my practical car, was dragging herself across the dirty floor. She reached out her shaking hands, clutching desperately at the hem of my tailored crimson gown. "Please, Diana!" Barbara wept, her voice a broken, pathetic rasp that echoed with total devastation. "You are my daughter. Please stop this. Tell them it is a mistake. We will lose the house. We will lose the cars, the accounts, everything. They are going to take everything from us." I looked down at the woman who had belittled me for 27 years. I slowly crouched down, bringing my face level with hers. The expensive floral perfume she always bathed in could not mask the sour stench of her sheer panic. The heavy tactical boots of the federal agents continued to stomp past us, shouting clear, sharp commands as they secured the perimeter of the Grand Conservatory. The elite guests, the billionaires and socialites my mother had spent her entire life trying to impress, were now being herded toward the exits, whispering furiously and recording the spectacular downfall of the Belmont family on their phones. I reached into my crimson clutch for the final time tonight. My fingers brushed past the empty space where my federal badge had been and closed around a thick, neatly folded stack of heavily stamped legal documents. I pulled them out and dropped them directly into her trembling lap. "You already lost the house, Mom," I said, my voice dead calm, stripping away the last remaining illusion she clung to. "You lost it 3 months ago." Barbara stared blindly at the papers. Her manicured hands shook so violently she could barely unfold the heavy parchment. When she finally did, her eyes darted across the bold black ink, the federal seals, and the irrefutable transfer of deeds. She let out a choking, breathless gasp. "While you were busy letting Tyrone convert my childhood bedroom into a walk-in cigar humidor, he was busy leveraging 3 illegal high-interest mortgages against the Belmont estate." I explained, keeping my tone as clinical and detached as if I were reading a weather report. "He used your forged signatures to secure the capital for Gavin's offshore shell companies. He essentially stole your home right out from under you to fund his own fraudulent lifestyle, and you were too busy bragging about his fake wealth to ever check your own bank statements." Barbara shook her head frantically, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. "You told everyone at the country club that I was a financial failure because I rented a modest apartment downtown instead of buying a flashy condo." I continued, making sure every word landed with maximum impact. "You laughed when I refused to let Tyrone manage my savings. What you did not know was that my apartment was modest because I was funneling every cent of my federal salary, along with the quiet inheritance Grandma Martha left me, into an anonymous proxy trust." I leaned in just a fraction closer, forcing her to look into my eyes. "When Tyrone's fraudulent shell companies began to collapse under the weight of my active federal investigation, his creditors panicked. They liquidated his held debt for pennies on the dollar to avoid total losses. And my proxy trust bought every single one of those mortgages. I own the Belmont estate. I own the luxury cars you leased under my forged name. I own the very marble floor you are currently crying on." A shrill, ear-piercing shriek shattered the air. Cassidy had been listening, paralyzed, as her entire fairy tale existence evaporated into thin air. The manicured hands that had eagerly accepted stolen diamond necklaces were now pulling at her own hair in a violent, unhinged panic. She looked at Tyrone, currently being hauled to his feet by 2 federal agents. His face was scraped and bleeding from where it had been forcefully pressed into the marble floor. The cuffs were tight around his wrists. He was not a billionaire. He was a heavily indebted federal prisoner. Cassidy realized in one crushing moment that she was penniless. She had quit her job years ago because Tyrone told her she would never have to work again. She had alienated all her friends with her insufferable bragging. Now she was shackled to a cratering mountain of debt and a felon husband. She dropped to her knees beside our mother, sobbing hysterically, her perfect makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "My credit cards!" Cassidy gasped, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. "The accounts are frozen. How am I supposed to pay for anything? Where am I supposed to go?" Thomas staggered forward, finally finding his voice over the din of handcuffs and shouting agents. He desperately tried to summon the authoritative, commanding tone he had used to terrorize boardrooms and his own family for decades. "You cannot do this to your own blood, Diana. Thomas demanded, his voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of rage and terror. "We are your family. You will reverse this. You will call off these agents and transfer those deeds back into my name immediately. I demand you fix this." I stood up smoothly, the heavy silk of my crimson dress rustling as I towered over my kneeling mother and weeping sister. I looked my father dead in the eye, feeling absolutely nothing but profound relief. "My family did not forge my name on a federal loan application," I stated coldly, my voice carrying to the agent standing nearby. "My family did not attempt to frame me for corporate espionage. My family did not mock my career while actively stealing millions from the American taxpayers to fund their pathetic vanity projects. You are not my family, Thomas. You are just another corrupt syndicate I was assigned to dismantle." Thomas opened his mouth to shout another demand, but a federal agent stepped between us, placing a heavy, unyielding hand on my father's shoulder. "Thomas Belmont, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and tax evasion," the agent announced, spinning my father around and clicking a pair of steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Thomas let out a sharp cry of indignation, but the agent marched him swiftly toward the exit, dragging the formerly untouchable patriarch out of his own ballroom in disgrace. I turned my back on Thomas, dismissing his existence entirely, and looked down at Barbara and Cassidy. They were clutching each other, now two women who had worshipped status and wealth above all else, left with absolutely nothing but the designer gowns on their backs and the terrifying reality of their impending poverty. The remaining federal agents were already moving through the estate, tagging artwork, seizing electronics, and securing the premises. "You have 48 hours to vacate my property," I announced, projecting my voice clearly so the surrounding federal agents could hear the legal eviction order. "Do not attempt to take any artwork, jewelry, or expensive furniture. It has all been officially inventoried and seized as federal evidence. You may take your personal clothing and nothing else." I paused, adjusting my crimson dress, letting a cold, utterly satisfied smile touch my lips as I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small. "And Mom," I said, my voice dripping with the exact same condescension she had used on me for 27 years. "Do not forget to clean the garage before you leave." 6 months later, the dust from that explosive night at the Belmont estate had finally settled, leaving behind a completely unrecognizable landscape. The federal wheels of justice grind notoriously slow, but when fueled by irrefutable ironclad digital evidence, they operate with terrifying efficiency. The resulting trial was less of a legal battle and more of a highly publicized corporate execution. It became the premier media spectacle of the year, broadcast across every major financial news network. I sat in the gallery every single day watching the destruction of the people who had tried to destroy me. Gavin lost his signature smirk the moment the prosecution played the audio recordings of him bragging about his fake marriage. Tyrone shed his tough guy persona when the money laundering ledger was projected onto the courtroom screens, detailing exactly how he had siphoned funds through overseas accounts. Heather, who had spent her entire life shielded by her father's billions, finally realized that Richard had entirely cut her off. He did not attend a single hearing. He did not hire her a defense team. He left her to rely on a public defender who looked exhausted just standing next to her. The sentencing was swift and merciless. The judge handed Gavin a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and bigamy. Tyrone received 20 years for racketeering, grand larceny, and threatening a federal agent. Heather, weeping hysterically and begging for a leniency she had never once extended to another human being, was sentenced to 10 years for corporate espionage and evidence tampering. The untouchable elite were traded into orange jumpsuits, their country club memberships permanently revoked. The collateral damage, however, was what truly balanced the scales of justice. Thomas and Barbara lost everything. The federal seizure of the Belmont estate was absolute. Their bank accounts were frozen, their assets liquidated to pay off the massive legal penalties and back taxes they had accumulated while trying to maintain their fraudulent lifestyle. The high society friends they had spent decades cultivating dropped them with brutal immediacy. Wealthy circles treat poverty like a highly contagious disease, and my parents were suddenly patient zero. They now lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The building smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and old carpet. There were no crystal chandeliers, no sprawling manicured lawns, and certainly no driveway to scrub. Thomas, a man who once commanded boardrooms, spent his days arguing with the property manager about a leaking radiator. Barbara, who used to spend thousands on weekly spa treatments, was now clipping grocery coupons and riding the public bus. The irony was almost poetic. They were finally living the exact ordinary paycheck-to-paycheck life they had mocked me for embracing. But the most spectacular fall from grace belonged to Cassidy. The golden child, the beloved socialite who had ridiculed my practical wardrobe and sensible career, had crashed back down to earth with zero safety nets. With Tyrone's assets seized by the federal government and his offshore accounts drained to pay restitution, Cassidy was left with absolutely nothing. The designer gowns and diamond tennis bracelets were auctioned off to pay her mounting legal fees. Last week, out of pure morbid curiosity, I drove past a worn-down 24-hour diner on the highway off-ramp. Through the greasy glass window, I saw her. Cassidy was wearing a stained polyester uniform, her hair tied back in a messy knot, balancing a tray of dirty coffee mugs on one hip, while wiping down a sticky laminate table with a gray rag. She looked exhausted, hollow, and utterly defeated. The woman who had proudly declared she would never work a day in her life was now surviving on minimum wage and loose change left by truck drivers. The illusion of the golden child was completely obliterated. I did not go inside. I did not need to gloat. Seeing reality enforce its own brutal consequences was satisfying enough. I turned my back on the diner and drove back to the city. My reality, on the other hand, had expanded beyond anything they could have ever comprehended. The federal courts had not only restored the $5 million Gavin and Thomas had attempted to steal, but they had also awarded me massive punitive damages for the emotional distress and identity theft. My proxy trust had fully absorbed the liquidated Belmont assets, expanding my personal portfolio into the tens of millions. I stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony of my new luxury penthouse in the heart of downtown. The air up here was crisp and clean. The sprawling city skyline glittered beneath me, a vast network of lights and opportunities. The penthouse was sleek, minimalist, and paid for entirely in cash. It was the ultimate manifestation of the quiet, invisible success I had spent years building in the shadows while my family chased cheap applause. My phone buzzed in my pocket, cutting through the serene silence of the evening. The caller ID displayed the secure encrypted line of the Vanguard Financial Executive Board. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Diana," the sharp, authoritative voice of the CEO greeted me. "The board has just concluded our final vote. Given your exceptional handling of the syndicate infiltration and your flawless recovery of the stolen corporate assets, the decision was unanimous." "I appreciate the update, sir," I replied, leaning against the glass railing. "It is my absolute pleasure to officially offer you the position of Executive Director of Forensic Operations. You will have full autonomy over your own division, a doubled operating budget, and direct reporting line to me. Congratulations." "I accept," I said, a slow, deep sense of vindication washing over me. "I will have my new operational protocols on your desk by Monday morning." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I picked up my mug of dark roast coffee from the patio table and took a slow, deliberate sip. The warm, rich flavor was grounding. I looked out over the glowing city, the skyscrapers reaching up into the night sky like monuments to ambition and resilience. My family had called me a boring data cruncher. They had called me a failure. They had tried to turn me into the scapegoat for their own greed, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the rules of the game. They played for the audience. I played for the board. The revenge was not just sweet, it was perfectly mathematically calculated. And as I watched the city lights reflect in the dark coffee, I knew my real life was finally just beginning.